Hi, I'm Marcus Winters. I'm an associate professor at the Boston University Wheelock College of Education and Human Development. I'm also the faculty director of the Wheelock Educational Policy Center. And I'm here to talk about my recent paper with Nathan Jones, also at BU, Are Two Teachers Better Than One? The Effect of Co-Teaching on Students with and Without Disabilities. So co-teaching's emerged as a common strategy for educating both students with and without disabilities. The idea here is that a general education teacher and a special education teacher work together to instruct both students with and without disabilities in the same classroom. So in theory, both the teachers are fully responsible for all of the students in the classroom. So the special education teacher is not limited only to the students with disabilities. So the logic behind co-teaching has a lot of intuitive appeal, and this is why I think that it's heavily supported by policymakers and also within the special education literature. That said, we lack rigorous evidence on its effects. So there are some studies that report that co-teaching leads to very large positive effects on student outcomes, but these studies are limited and have at least one and sometimes both of two serious problems. They could be using research designs that are just not capable of making causal estimates. The other thing that can happen is that they're using samples that are so small, often limited to a single school or even a single classroom, that we don't have any reason to believe that we can pick up those results and apply them into larger contexts. In this paper, we're going to use longitudinal data from Massachusetts in order to provide the first estimate of the causal effect of co-teaching on both students with and without disabilities within the context of a large public school system. Our primary approach is going to use fixed effects in order to hold constant everything about students and schools that don't change over time. So in essence, what we're going to do is for each individual student, we're going to compare their performance in a co-taught class versus their performance in a single teacher class. And then we're going to aggregate up all those differences for each of those students and to get an average effect of co-teaching. So this figure illustrates our main results. And what we see, so the dot in the triangle is the estimated effect of co-teaching. The line going through it is the 95% confidence interval. And what we see is overall a positive story. So overall, we see positive effects from co-teaching, both for students with disabilities and for students without disabilities on the ELA exam and on the math exam, and for students in elementary grades and in students in middle school grades. So overall positive effects. The other thing that's important to note in this figure, though, is the magnitude of these effects, so which we see on the vertical axis here. So these effects that we're seeing are positive, but they're actually quite small relative to other interventions that we might try. So for instance, even this largest effect that we see for students with disabilities in middle school math, the effect that we're getting here for co-teaching would fall into the category of a small effect within the recent taxonomy suggested by Matt Kraft's recent paper, for instance. And all of these effects are much smaller than the results from prior studies that I mentioned previously. So because we can't randomly assign students into co-taught classrooms, we have to make assumptions in order to treat our estimates as the causal effect of co-teaching. And so the main assumption that we're making in our primary analysis is that for an individual student, at what time in their academic career they're in a co-taught class or a single teacher classroom is as good as randomly assigned. But we might worry that it could be the case that students are systematically put into co-taught classrooms based on their performance at the end of the prior year. So after an especially good or bad year. And that's going to bias our estimates if that's the case. So our approach to addressing that problem is we're going to compare our primary results to the results from a model that instead is going to control for a lagged, the student's test score at the end of the prior year. And what that model does is it makes the opposite assumption about the nature of selection into a co-taught classroom. It assumes that students are placed into a co-taught classroom based on their performance in the prior year. So, and it can be shown that because these two models make opposing assumptions, opposite assumptions about the nature of selection that needs to be accounted for in order to get the causal effect of co-teaching, the true causal effect of co-teaching is going to lie between those two estimates. And we'll be able to take advantage of that by comparing the results from the two approaches. So this figure compares the results from these two approaches. And what we see is that the estimated effect of co-teaching is actually very, very similar across these two approaches. In very few cases is the estimate from one model significantly different from the estimate from the other model. There's a couple cases where what was a positive effect in our primary model becomes a negative estimate in the alternative model. But in these cases, it's just because the positive effect was already so small that the small reduction in the effect in the other model tends to move it across the zero line. One thing that we definitely can do in this analysis is we can rule out that co-teaching has a meaningful effect on student outcomes. So there's two notable limitations that we should talk about here about our analysis. First is that we're evaluating the average effect of co-teaching as implemented across a large school system. That's not the same as evaluating the effect of co-teaching when done well under perfect conditions. So it's actually possible that co-teaching overall has a positive effect when done with best practices, but when implemented at scale, many teachers might not use those the best practices when they're co-teaching. So overall, we see a much more muted effect. Now, that's important to note that we're not getting we're not getting a true estimate of co-teaching itself. But from a policy perspective, what we are looking at is the effect of co-teaching as it's been implemented across the state. The second important limitation here is we don't have any information here, and we're aware of no prior research giving us information about the costs associated with co-teaching. And this is important, especially given that we find overall a small positive effect for students. So we've talked informally with policymakers who've told us that in their view, co-teaching does add costs. But that's not definitive. We need a much better measure. We need real research on how much this policy costs, or moving into co-teaching costs, in order to assess the effectiveness of the policy overall relative to its costs. So to summarize, we find that co-teaching leads to small test score improvements for both students with disabilities and students without disabilities. And though these results are somewhat promising, we require additional information about the costs associated with co-teaching in order to really make a determination about whether it's an effective strategy. However, we will say that it seems unlikely that the small benefits that we're seeing here could justify the considerable support for co-teaching that co-teaching has received in the special education literature, and also the push to increase co-teaching by policymakers in recent years.